I am Kori Schake, the Deputy Director General of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and I am super pleased that today we have Professor Sulmaan Khan from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy here to talk about his fabulous new book, just out from Harvard University Press, called Haunted by Chaos. Please come on in. I was starting early because I want us all to have the maximum amount of time we can. So here at the Institute, we organize our research program into 3 lines of inquiry. One on war, one on power, and one on rules. And with all the discussion about the rise of China and what it means for the liberal international order and whether power transitions at high levels can happen peacefully, very many of us who are dusting it up over this argument about the liberal international order talk a lot about Western strategy. And we neither know nor talk nearly enough about Chinese strategy, domestically and internationally. And one of my very favorite things about this terrific book is that it looks at the strategy of Chinese leaders from Mao Zedong forward. Won't you join me in welcoming Dr. Sulmaan Khan to talk about his fabulous new book, which those of you who haven't bought it, buy it from Harvard. It's great.
Thank you. Well, thanks very much, Courtney. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here for several different reasons. One is that as an academic, relying on the research and facts that are put out of IISS has been just a boon, whether it's survival or the strategic survey. So thank you for all you do to make our work possible.
Yay!
I also want to say that as someone living in the United States through turbulent times when the world seems to have gone crazy, knowing that someone like Kori Schake is still thinking and writing about civil-military relations and remains an unrepentant never-Trumper has been deeply encouraging to those of us who hope that there is a better future around the corner. So it's a privilege to be sitting at the table with you. I'll tell you a bit about how the book came to be by way of explaining how we got to there. The book, for a book about grand strategy, was born in a very ungrandly strategic moment. I was in Taiwan at the time, and research had not been going well for various reasons. This brown smog had descended on the city, which made what's otherwise a charming place completely demoralizing. To top it all off, the TV was on in this brown smog, and the news was blaring about how Kim had tested another nuclear device. And of course the American punditry came on the news to talk about, well, we're not going to be able to get anywhere with North Korea till the Chinese get on board. What will it take to get the Chinese on board with North Korea? And because I was in a very bad mood, I kind of flung the remote at the TV and sort of shouted at it, saying, why don't they understand that Korea is part of a larger problem to China? Korea is not something that China sees in isolation. It's something that it sees in connection with the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and overall concerns of national security. Until all those things are on the table, expecting much movement on the Korean issue is kind of foolhardy. And as I shouted this in much angrier tones than I just gave it to you, it occurred to me that that went back to discussions I'd had about the Mao years with people. And that you could see stretching from Mao Zedong to now certain conceptions of national security and how to get there, a grand strategy, if you would, that was worth discussing and that would probably inform our contemporary discussions about China a bit better. So what do I mean by grand strategy? It's a term that gets tossed around a lot. I mean quite simply marshalling different categories of power, diplomatic, economic, and military, to pursue overarching national objectives. So not the way we talk about policy in day-to-day very often, where it's the Russians did X in Syria, what do we do now? Or the Chinese have invested Y amount in One Belt, One Road, what do we do now? What Chinese leaders seem to have is this conception of what do we want in the world, which is a pretty easy question seemingly, but really hard to answer. How is what's happening in the world affecting our capacity to get what we want? And then how do we get there? I'm not saying everything fit within that overarching view, but quite a bit did, and it was worth thinking about. And it also turned out that there was both a consistency to the way China's paramount leaders had thought about the world, and differences. The consistency stemmed from two things. One was a memory of being broken, and being broken in very specific ways. It's kind of easy for me to sit here and say, oh, the Chinese state was carved apart at various points, and Chinese leaders carried that with them. It's important, if you want to understand where Chinese leaders are coming from, to try to imagine being the leader of a country and waking up every morning and not taking the integrity of the state for granted. We take it for granted, or used to at least, that the United States or Britain or wherever would survive and endure. For these people, the possibility of the state falling apart at any moment is a given, and they live with it. Whether it's memories of the warlord era, whether it's memories of the Cultural Revolution, whether it's memories of Tiananmen Square, or whether it's stories of a farther time, the Opium Wars and what happened then. Geography mattered too. That's the other source of consistency. These were people dealing with a country that had a long, vulnerable coast and very long, porous land frontiers, which means fundamentally their view of the world was going to be different from a country that was bordered by Canada, Mexico, and 3 oceans, or a tiny island at the edge of Europe. It's just going to give you a different worldview. Differences came in because personality and circumstance matter in history too. Deng Xiaoping is a very different leader from Mao Zedong or Xi Jinping, and that means the way he deals with that basic conundrum is going to be different. Circumstance matters too. Trying to secure China in 1949 is different from trying to do it in 1969, different again from 79 or 89, and different again from today. But all of these people, with all those differences, continued to see China as a very brittle entity in a hostile world. And their overarching objective was to protect it, give it basic security. Basic security sounds very banal till you remember, one, what I said about the idea of China falling apart being something that haunted these people. It's not something they took for granted. And the other reason you might want to think about basic security a little more seriously is the way we discuss China in the news. So China is out to overthrow the liberal world order. China is out to take over the world. China is out to replace the United States as global hegemon. Some of those things might happen, but they would be instrumental to that intrinsic goal of basic security, and that's worth understanding. The means of pursuing that goal were, one, pursuing a balance of power, both during the Cold War and after, modernizing the military without disrupting the political economy too much, and all the while trying to keep the citizenry on the side of the party and state. The exact mix of power and the way the goal was pursued would vary from time to time, but these, to my mind at least, were variations on a common theme, not departures from a theme as such. And I think the best place to begin understanding this is to ask how the state came into existence, and to go back to 1920, when a man named Mao Zedong says, 4,000-year-old Great China, by which he meant the China of stories, the China whose boundaries are more or less where they are today. 4,000-year-old Great China is a myth, not reality. He says what you have in 1920 are many little Chinas, and the way to get to a big country is to fortify those little bases and cobble them together. Doesn't have a very clear idea of where the boundaries of that great China lie, but he does have this vision of something larger that he's going to get. And this idea of fortifying small bases is interesting because one of the most interesting things Mao does is he insists that his little patch of land, the Jiangxi Soviet, is a state. This is really remarkable because it's not China by any stretch of imagination, but Mao says no. We have the right to levy taxes, we have the right to enter into diplomatic negotiations, we will retain a monopoly of the use of force within our territory. All the attributes that we associate with statehood, Mao claimed for his little patch of land. State could also go traveling. When his great rivals, the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek, seized the Soviet from him, Mao says we can take the state on the road, and even on the road, we will retain all those attributes of statehood. Now, we all know the basics of Maoist warfare. Mobilize the peasants, and they're going to be on your side, and that'll be good. When the enemy advances, we retreat. When the enemy retreats, we advance. Less talked about is Mao as a diplomat during these years, and it turns out Mao has a very good conception of the balance of power. He, like Bismarck would have had it, wanted to be closer to everyone than they were to one another. So there's outreach to the Tibetans, outreach to Muslim warlords. during the Civil War. There is also outreach during World War II to foreigners. The Soviets are asked for help. The Americans are asked for help. Interestingly, given all the propaganda today, the Japanese are asked for help as late as 1941. This is when the nationalists and communists have come together, supposedly. And it turns out Mao is saying, if the nationalists seem to be getting too powerful, we might want to work with pro-Japanese forces to balance against them. The idea is the protection of China, but the protection of his China, not everybody else's. It's an interesting question to wonder when the war ended, when World War II ended, if Mao's China and Chiang Kai-shek's China could have coexisted. There seems to be some indication that he was prepared to do that. And you could have had a situation in which you had two countries, kind of like India and Pakistan, where they go to war, tensions simmer down, not exactly reconciled to one another's existence, but living with what constrains them. But that doesn't happen. The Civil War is renewed and Mao prevails, with a grand strategy similar to the one that saw his survival during World War II and the pre-war years. Diplomacy, there's a lot of peeling away of Chiang's generals, saying, come work for us instead. Attention to political economy. It's not that he's an economic genius. He doesn't have to be. He just has to be a little bit better at it than Chiang Kai-shek is, which turns out to not be terribly hard. It's a little harder than I made it sound. One thing worth bearing in mind is that some of the most serious and formative engagements of the Chinese Civil War come after October 1st, 1949, when the PRC is proclaimed. So the taking of Xinjiang and Tibet, that happens after October 1st, 1949. And that's where you begin to see them realizing the importance of air power, which they do in help with the Soviets. Hainan Island is taken after October 1st, 1949. And the idea that naval warfare was something they would have to learn about is something that comes to them from the first defeat they suffered to the nationalists in a long time at the Battle of Guningtou and Jinmen Island. And naval power becomes something they start focusing on and applying to the conquest of Hainan, which of course gives them access to the South China Sea. So you're beginning to see the transformation of what's essentially been a bunch of ragtag guerrillas into a serious fighting force, into what you would think of as a modern military. The other thing that happens at this time is Mao goes and has a chat with Joseph Stalin. There's two things that are worth harping on here. One is that we don't tend to think of either Mao or Stalin as pacifists. That's not the reputation they have. But during this time, they're actually very eager for peace. They talk about what they could do with 5 years of peace, 10 years of peace, 15 years of peace. Stalin gets really ambitious and goes for 20 years of peace because they want some time to rebuild. The other thing that's worth noting is that even as he's in Moscow talking to Stalin, who is ideologically sympathetic to him, Mao is cabling his subordinates in Beijing saying, I want you to reach out to the Americans, I want you to reach out to the British, I want you to reach out to all the Europeans, because we need to trade with them. He's going to lean to one side, but leaning to one side doesn't mean falling over. Just because people are capitalists and imperialists doesn't mean you stop dealing with them. And it's interesting to speculate on where that would have gone had they had their 5, 10, 15, 20 years of peace. But of course they don't get that because the Korean War happens. The decision-making on Korea is not a given on any side. The Americans were not sure they wanted to go into this. They'd actually gone through a whole exercise where the Korean Peninsula was not deemed to be an area of key strategic importance. And in China itself, there's quite a bit of debate about this. Mao wants to go to the Korean War because the Koreans are his revolutionary brothers in arms. During the Civil War, some of the communists had taken refuge with them. But there are a lot of people saying, we're tired of fighting. We have a country to rebuild. We have other problems to think about. Why do you want to go to Korea? And Mao has to fly in one of his ace fighters, Peng Dehuai, to come make the case for it. And Peng says, look, geostrategically, you cannot hold this country we have just won with hostile forces on your northeastern frontier and along the coast. Harry Truman has, of course, neutralized the Taiwan Strait at this point. If you want to keep this state, you will have to go to fight. And that is what tips the balance. The other interesting thing about Korea is that it's not happening in isolation. It's one war among many that the PRC is fighting. The most serious war, for sure, but there are hostile forces from Taiwan ravaging the coast. There are still Kuomintang nationalist fighters down south. They still have to worry about Xinjiang and Tibet. They're still worried about Americans parachuting in all along those land frontiers. So they're fighting a war on multiple fronts. And even with the armistice that takes place in 1953, that problem, the basic strategic problem, doesn't go away. And they have a grand strategy for dealing with this. The first element of that, as I mentioned, is seeking a balance of power. So we will work with the Soviets. The Soviets are ideologically sympathetic. They give us money. They give us weapons. That's a good thing. But just because we're working with the Soviets doesn't mean we forget about everyone else. They will keep trying to talk to the Americans. Those talks will founder over disagreements on Taiwan. But one of the basic precepts of Chinese diplomacy at this time seems to be, just because you don't reach an agreement, just because you don't reach a conclusion, you don't give up on talks. The point of talks isn't just to reach an agreement, that would be a good thing. The point of talks in many ways is to keep talking so that you can stay alive and maybe find room for agreement tomorrow. The other interesting thing about their conception of the balance of power is that it's not just the great powers of the world they're thinking about. They think in terms of the importance of smaller powers too. So countries like India matter. Countries like Pakistan matter. Speaking of countries like Pakistan, just because someone is allied with the Americans, as the Pakistanis are, or the Thais are, or the British or the Japanese are, doesn't mean you stop talking to them. You can reach out to them. You might be able to peel them away from the Americans. You might even be able to convince them to convince the Americans to be reasonable, which is something they try quite a bit of doing. So diplomacy is important, and it's important because, one, you can achieve a balance of power, and two, because it gives you room to breathe. It's not that they're not going to use force at this point in time. They do use force in the Taiwan Straits, though they try to use it in a controlled fashion. There's this very dangerous idea, to my mind, but you can see why they would think this, that force can be used to signal intentions. You can dial it up and down to bring people to the negotiating table. And of course, the decision to build a nuclear bomb was taken pretty early in 1955. The late 50s and early 60s see a shift in the strategic environment, and with that, a need for Mao's China to find a new balance of power. There is a spat with the Soviets. I've always found the term split a little unsatisfactory because it implies something that happened once and was over. This is more of a back and forth. Can we work it out? Well, I hate you relationship. There's a ridiculous spat over joint radar and nuclear submarines. There is angst over the Soviet refusal to stand up for China as they see it on Taiwan and Tibet, the crossing of nomads into Xinjiang, which comes with all sorts of problems. And in all this, they perceive Nikita Khrushchev as someone who's sitting on the imperialist fence. Now, the interesting thing they do is they don't write Khrushchev off as a result of that. The idea is maybe we can win the Soviets back if we alternately threaten and blandish them. It makes a certain amount of sense to leave room to reach an agreement, even as you're criticizing and carping at the other person. This does have a massive impact on relations with North Korea and Vietnam, which are both aghast at seeing their two patrons fight, but also very pleased at being able to swing back and forth between them and say, why don't you give us a little more weaponry? The North Koreans, it turns out, are especially good at this. There's a similar dynamic in South Asia. China and India, which had heralded the rise of Afro-Asian unity and the post-colonialist world against empire, fall apart over Tibet. And during that war, what happens is that just because you lose India, so to speak, doesn't mean you give up on South Asia as a whole. You reach out to Pakistan, you reach out to Nepal, you reach out to Burma, because these smaller countries matter too. They get that importance instinctively, though how it translates into on-the-ground engagement is a different matter. Militarily, the strategy remains the same. You do have to be prepared to fight on multiple fronts. The war with India comes at the same time as a scare about Taiwan. Naval growth continues. This is around the time when they start finding they can patrol and set up stuff on the Paracel Islands. So it remains a formidable force, and of course at this point they get the nuclear bomb. The other element that matters to grand strategy is political economy. And here, of course, the discussion tends to focus on the Great Leap Forward, which was that mad idea to surpass Britain and the United States, which gets you massive communes, massive dams, and tens of millions of dead. Proof positive that just because you have a grand strategy doesn't mean it's a very good one, which is the case over here. Now, the thing that gets overlooked about the Great Leap Forward very often is it's not just about surpassing the Brits and Americans for the sake of it. This is actually a national security plan. Mao, when he's articulating the rationale for this, says, look, you can't have a modern military. You can't have modern defense if you don't have a modern economy. We got torn apart before because we didn't have the economic strength to field a proper military, and that's what's got to change. So he's got an idea that's exactly the same, really, as Deng Xiaoping's later, which he gets enormous credit for. It's just that in the implementation of it, he has some pretty horrible ideas that go horribly wrong. He is allowed to persist in them, by the way, because he's got a whole army of people, including Zhao Ziyang, who's later going to be sanctified as Deng Xiaoping's great economic reformer, saying, no, Chairman Mao, it's not the idea that's wrong. The policy's fine. It's just that the people implementing it are bad people. They're stealing grain. They're not implementing your plans properly. If you had proper implementation, we'd solve all this within a month, max. And that allows Mao to persist, in spite of his own philosophical doubts, in ways that prove incredibly destructive to China. And in that notion that it's not the planning that's at fault, but the people, that if you just remolded the staff slightly, everything would work out okay, you can begin to see the seeds of something like the Cultural Revolution. So the Cultural Revolution is a tricky phrase. It's a tricky phrase because it obscures how many different things actually happened in China between 1966 and 1976, the period it's supposed to cover. The first phase is the dramatic attacks on embassies, the madness abroad, a departure from just about everything China we've talked about thus far has done. The second phase is marked by a return to strategic prudence. And that's triggered, of course, by the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, which gets Mao thinking, what if this happens to me? And at that point, the Chinese begin to work towards a rapprochement with the Americans and are very lucky in having an administration in Washington that is thinking in similar terms. One thing that's worth saying here, because the story just gets mistold so often, the way we tell it in America is the Soviets and the Chinese fell out, Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon swooped in, won the Chinese over from the Soviets, and that was life, and wasn't it wonderful? That's not how it happened. There's an actual gap between the border clashes in 1969 and Henry Kissinger's visit to Beijing. During that gap, the Chinese aren't stupid. They don't think they can count on the Americans to do stuff, because who knows what the Americans are going to do. So there is a very concerted attempt to dial tensions down with the Soviets that actually pays off. And even when the Americans come to terms with China, that doesn't mean you stop negotiating with the Soviets, because just because the Americans have decided to be friendly today doesn't mean things are going to stay that way. And you keep talking to the Soviets, and you keep letting the Americans know you're talking to the Soviets just because you want to preserve your options. It's not just Henry Kissinger who knows that in a triangular relationship you want to be closer to the other two sides than they are to one another. He has the luxury of distance, which allows him to do that, but the Chinese statesmen of the time are keen to do that too. The other thing that comes with rapprochement, by the way, is the beginning of opening and reform, which is something we associate with the Deng era, but actually happens in the tail end of the Mao years. One indicator of this, of course, is that Deng Xiaoping himself, who had been rusticated during the Cultural Revolution, is rehabilitated. And he tells Mao, look, you've got to put this country to work. There is enormous entrepreneurial energy at the edges and in the provinces, and you can't have a country where they're waiting for central directives on what to produce. Let them loose. He says, look, there's a global economy. Everybody, even the Americans, has to be part of it. We're nowhere right now. Let us be part of it. And Mao says, hop to it. And lo and behold, the opening part of opening and reform happens. Trade with America burgeons as one indicator, as does that with Japan. Exports to the United States go from none to about $156 million worth between 1971 and 76. Imports go from nothing to over $160 million worth. China is open for business. The problem is that the dark forces Mao had unleashed in the early years of the Cultural Revolution never went away. You can start a Cultural Revolution, calling it off is another matter altogether. Right. It is. And there are people who actually believe this gospel of revolution, not production, as they called it, the infamous Gang of Four. And they go after Deng Xiaoping and Zhou Enlai, the people they see as technocrats raged on the side of opening and reform. So you get revolution and opening and reform duking it out in the high politics of China, with Mao sort of flexing in the middle, kind of seeming to want to preserve his own position and not sure which faction is going to get stronger. At a certain point, he gets the idea that Deng Xiaoping is getting too big for his britches and wants to replace Mao. And that's where Deng's defeat comes in. July 4th, 1976, Deng is stripped of his posts and sent away to a quote-unquote safe place. Hua Guofeng, whose main achievement was to look like Mao, is named Mao's successor. Mao himself dies in September 1976. So he's unified the country. He has stood off external threats, some fairly formidable ones. He has also left tens of millions of his own people dead and has created circumstances that could undo everything he has achieved. Make of him what you will. Could have gone very differently from this point out, but it's Deng Xiaoping who comes into the picture. There's lots of things to say about Deng Xiaoping, who's an absolutely fascinating character. To my mind, the most important one is that Deng traveled by boat. There is nothing, my young friend, absolutely nothing, as Water Rat says to Mole, half so much worth doing as simply messing about in boats. If you've simply messed about in boats the way Deng Xiaoping has, you're going to see things that someone like Mao, who's traveled a lot, by the way, by land, isn't going to have seen. You're going to have traveled to ports, and you're going to have seen the possibility the ocean holds. Ships coming in bearing goods and ideas from abroad. You'll get a sense of the money that can be made when people dabble in several different languages by the docks. You'll go places and find overseas Chinese living there, take refuge with them and say, wait a minute, they're getting rich. Why isn't our country doing the same thing? That's the key to understanding Deng, I think. He does believe in the party. He believes in quashing warlordism and liberalism. He's seen what they can do. He is a very impatient and very caustic character. He doesn't suffer fools gladly, but he will suffer them. So when he makes his comeback and Hua Guofeng has taken on and defeated the Gang of Four, Deng is very clear on, I'm not here to interfere with this. Chairman Hua, you have won a great victory for the country, for the party, for the Chinese people. I exist only to serve. He did this during the Mao years and could do it all day if he wanted to. Deng alone, of all the people we're going to talk about today, doesn't hold the post of chairman of the country, chairman of the party, because if you're Deng Xiaoping, actual authority is cumbersome. It's much better to be a puppet master and have other people taking the blame for your ideas, or the credit, and just do what needs to be done and get the country going. We tend to take China's turn from Maoist revolution to opening and reform for granted, but it's not something that can be taken for granted at the time Deng makes his comeback. There were, as I mentioned, people who actually believed in the verities of revolution, not production. And Deng launches this dazzling act of intellectual warfare that makes the China you know today possible. And the way he does it is, he says, the problem with people who are preaching Mao Zedong thought, and a return to it, is you can't interpret Mao Zedong thought literally without doing damage to it. What you have to do is grasp the essence of Mao Zedong thought. And to truly get Mao Zedong thought, therefore, you have to grasp that its central precept is what Chairman Mao said, seek truth from facts. Okay? Seeking truth from facts, what do we see? We see that Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, they're racing ahead economically, and China's nowhere in the mix. We're still arguing about whether raising 3 ducks is socialism and 5 ducks capitalism, or whether letting wages rise to 50 yuan to 100 yuan to 200 yuan is going to be terribly destructive. This is no way to run a country, and this isn't seeking truth from facts. And the people who want you to think that way, the people who are intent on revolution, not production, and who are misinterpreting Mao Zedong thought, that's the Gang of Four, the people who visited all that misery in all of you. So it's a very clever way of saying being productive is what we want to do. Being productive is what Chairman Mao would have wanted. It's worth emphasizing that Deng is in no way sincere about any of this. He'll actually tell Bush Sr., it's not that, I'm a huge fan of Mao Zedong. It's just that to deny Mao Zedong at this point would be to deny a major part of this country's history. And to deny a major part of this country's history would cause chaos. And chaos, of course, is what we all want to avoid, because we want to get rich in order to be secure. So, agrarian reform is encouraged. If it works, let it work. Modernization of industry is encouraged. That means turning abroad for help. The Japanese, in particular, are courted for their expertise, their investment and trade deals. Technology transfer from the West is sought. And it's not just the great economic powerhouses of America and Japan that Deng is going after. Brazil is courted. France is courted. The Huaqiao, the overseas Chinese, have a huge role to play. There's always been this very happy and healthy smuggling relationship across the strait. And Deng says, this is great. You're all making money. Bring it out into the open. Let's all go with it. Whatever works, works, and Deng Xiaoping will let it do so. The other side to getting the economy in order is cuts. So there is cut to aid to third world countries. There is the one-child policy, which is an absolutely disastrous idea, but is articulated as a means of fiscal responsibility. And finally, and most importantly, perhaps there are cuts to the military. Deng says, you've got these aged heroes, the youngest of them are 64, 65, and they're drawing perks and salaries. This is no way to run a country. We're going to invest in the military, but we're going to invest in what we need, and we don't need all these people. We do need a navy. Not a blue water navy, because we have no intention of going and conquering places. We need a navy that can protect our shores. We need an air force, and that's where the investment is going to go. So let's get some cuts, and let's get our military budget in order. It's not that he's a pacifist. It's not that he doesn't believe in the use of force. It is that a military is meant to protect you. And if it is cannibalizing the economy and weakening it, then it is defeating the object it's meant to serve. You have to have a proper balance between the military and the political economy, and Deng Xiaoping is out to get it. Diplomatically, he has that same notion of the balance of power that marks the Mao years and of not stopping talks. Close to home, one country, two systems is his favorite phrase, as is joint development. These are his big innovations with which he's ridiculously pleased. He does take back Hong Kong. By the way, the agreement reached over Hong Kong is very similar to the one he negotiated with Tibet back in 1950, 1951, which is a harbinger of one country, two systems. It's worth comparing the texts of the two side by side and seeing the similarities. One country, two systems doesn't work with Taiwan, which he offers it to. But it does start a raging debate there, which is a lot more than you could have hoped for during the Mao years. And he also offers this idea of joint development to the Philippines. Of course, these disputed waters are ours, but why let the dispute get in the way of business? Shouldn't we work on them together? With the great powers, he does reach out to the Americans. He doesn't stop talking to them, even though he's angry over the Taiwan Relations Act and American arms sales to Taiwan. He will hector them over and over again on it and say at the end of each hectoring, but this is because you're our friends. We're hectoring you because you're our friends. With Japan, yes, the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands are a problem, textbooks are a problem, but Japan is the main engine for the Chinese economy at this point. Why let squabbles get in the way of getting rich? Even with the Soviets, there are very patient negotiations. These come to a brief halt when the Soviets invade Afghanistan but are resumed. And as he's very keen to point out to everybody, at no point does he sever trade relations. You can keep talking despite disagreements. It doesn't matter if your demands aren't met immediately, as long as they get met tomorrow, which might happen if you keep communicating. There's one big exception to all this, that's Vietnam. China invades Vietnam, gets smashed, retreats, and then refuses to talk to the Vietnamese forever. There are many different explanations for why that happened, which we can go into during Q&A if you want to. The simplest one, to my mind, is the truest. Deng made a mistake. Even the grandest of grand strategists are inconsistent sometimes. If any of you has had the experience of walking around and then doing something that seems completely out of character and wondering, why did I do it? You'll understand what Deng went through there. The one thing I want to emphasize is that the Tiananmen Square massacre is part and parcel of this grand strategy. One of the things American academics struggle with a lot is how can a country that's economically liberalizing have cracked down so hard politically? And Deng would have said that's the wrong question. The reason we were able to liberalize economically is because we had a strong political power at the center, forcing people in the provinces to liberalize economically or allowing them to liberalize economically when it happened. What's allowed China to thrive is the stability guaranteed by party rule. When protests break out in 1986, he says they have to be stopped, and the problem is that the party's not asserting its authority. And he talks about how these protests could take us back to the Cultural Revolution. So when 1989 happens, the biggest unanswerable question to my mind is not, why did he roll out the tanks? It's, what on earth took him so long? Which is a question that will have to await further archival opening. Deng Xiaoping doesn't like young people. Young people don't know what we've been through. They haven't seen what we've seen. They don't remember the warlord era. They just take everything for granted. It's also worth remembering that it was a bunch of rampaging students who turned his son into a paraplegic, which is very much on his mind, where most people would see just nice students protesting for democracy. Deng sees a mob that could undo everything he has done. And so that is why the tanks get rolled out. Now, the interesting thing is that right after it, there are a lot of people saying this happened because you let opening and reform happen. It's part and parcel of that. And we should turn back the clock and go back to the Mao years now. And Deng says no. This was for a purpose. It was to protect opening and reform. And even though he's retired, Deng Xiaoping, who is celebrated for having instituted a retirement system, which the foul Xi Jinping violated subsequently, Deng Xiaoping, who at this point doesn't hold a formal position of authority, comes marching out of retirement and goes down south by train, by foot, talking to people and saying, you all have a stake in opening and reform, don't you? It's populist politics before people are talking about populist politics, and it works. Opening and reform is the course that China is going to stay on, at least during Deng's lifetime. Retirement's for other people. If you don't hold a formal position of authority, you can do whatever you want to. The devil take retirement. But even Deng would have had to die someday, so presumably he could have been waited out. And this is where the question of Deng's successors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, comes in. The rap against them used to be, and still is, that they were kind of dull people. These aren't the men Deng was. These aren't even the men Mao was. They don't do anything. It might be that I'm getting older. It might be that we're living through strange times, but I've begun to have a real fondness for dull leaders. It's astonishing how much a good bit of boredom at the right time can do for a country. When you think of all that was weathered during the Jianghu years for China, crises in the Taiwan Straits, financial crises, a spy plane incident with the Americans, you begin to realize quite a bit goes on, and just by being dull, they manage to navigate it in a not bad way. The first thing Jiang Zemin does is, there's actual questions about where China is going to go post-89. You could go back to the Mao years, which some people are calling for. You could democratize the way the rest of the world has. So there's a lot of options. And Jiang says we're going to stick with what's worked, but we're going to bring ideology back into the mix. Not ideology the way it used to be, but ideology as a set of rituals, as a test of fealty. Something that binds this huge party in this country together, something that tells young people you can't just go around doing whatever you want and expecting Western ways to work here, but something that makes it work for us. It's not that he's an ideologue. He'll actually tell Joseph Breer, I'm fine with whatever system you suggest that makes this country that has 1.23 billion people work. It's just that this is what holds people together, and just going through the ritual, going through the shibboleths, if you will, is something that allows us to function. Also, you can see this in his reflections in religion. More than any paramount leader I saw, Jiang seemed to have a real sensitivity to the idea that religion wasn't something you could just squash. You would have to work with it, and there would have to be a way of making it compatible with ideology. The version of ideology he invokes, of course, is Deng. So Mao Zedong thought leads you to Deng Xiaoping, getting rich, which is what we're going to continue with. That means you can stick with getting rich, extend the benefits to China's far west. When violence breaks out in Xinjiang, incidentally, one of the things that Hu Jintao does that's interesting is he doesn't just say, let's crack heads together, though he does that. He also focuses on economics, says the real problem is you need to bring GDP per capita in Xinjiang up to the level of the rest of the country. Similar talk for Tibet. So the economic dimension of this really matters, which means that the continuation of opening and reform and insisting on it is part of the grand strategy of this era. Now, there are challenges to getting rich. Getting rich is glorious, but it also means you can have corruption, which is a problem when you have one player that is cop, judge, and enforcer. It's never going to go away. The other thing that opening and reform does is it makes you vulnerable to global shocks. The more successful you get, the more vulnerable you're going to get. And when the Southeast Asian financial crisis happens, that means China has to step up and make sure money is available to investment banks, it has to keep the renminbi stable, and it has to boost internal demand. When the 2007-8 financial crisis hits, China's again swift to step in. There is a stimulus. There's also, and this reaches back to that idea of smaller countries mattering, a turn to the BRICS, to emerging markets. These are the places where having friends will help. And there is a hectoring of the Americans on the need not to turn back from all that has made us rich. You can't turn back from free trade, Hu Jintao tells the Americans. You cannot turn back from financial liberalization. You can't turn back from aid to third world countries. These things matter to all of us, and we have to keep them going. There are also lessons from 1989, and the ones that China takes are twofold. One is that the Americans want to keep us down, and they want to keep us down by bringing democratic change to us, just like they did with the rest of the world. The other interesting conception they have at the time is that there's a different idea of the way the Cold War ended. If in the United States we saw the end of the Cold War as the beginning of a unipolar era, the Soviets lost, we won, history ended, hey presto, Jiang Zemin says no. What we're actually seeing right now is a multipolar era. Yes, the Americans are prime center powers, but the Russians still matter, even though they're down. Europe matters and might go a different way from America on certain things. Japan matters. Latin America and Africa matters. So we've got to keep those countries on our side. Similar concept of the balance of power. We will keep talking to the Americans despite what might go wrong. There are several crises that happen in Sino-American relations. People talk about the state Sino-American relations are in today. There were several points during this time where it was much, much worse than anything you can imagine today. The Taiwan Straits crisis, the Hainan spy plane incident, the accidental on-purpose, depending on which side you talk to, bombing of the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia. A couple of things worth saying about these crises. One is that there is no way they should have been allowed to happen. It took a lot of irresponsibility on each side to escalate them to the level where people were seriously worried. The other thing that's worth noting, of course, is that they managed to dial them down. And on the Chinese side especially, there is a real willingness to try to de-escalate tension because there's too much going on in the rest of the world for us to worry about this stuff. The Americans have too much to offer to allow these things to get in the way. There is accession to the WTO to think about. There is further trade to think about. There's the Olympic bid to think about. Do we want to hold these things hostage to Taiwan or so forth? And the answer is no. So they managed to dial tensions down. America is just one piece on the board. Stronger relations with Russia and Central Asia are sought post 9/11 when you have the Americans running amok as the Chinese see it in Afghanistan. Having those people around is going to help. There's trade and exchange with Moscow. There are proclamations of friendship. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization kicks in at this time talking about working against terrorism, splitism, and extremism, and promoting multipolarization, which is a fancy way of saying keeping the Americans out of the region. Who calls these countries the old Silk Road? Anything who could do, she could do grander. So you get one belt, one road eventually. But what you're seeing is a geopolitical calculus very similar to that articulated by Jawaharlal Nehru and Zhou Enlai back in the 50s, which is Asia for the Asians. Keep the Americans out. And better relations are sought elsewhere too, including on Taiwan, incidentally. Lian Jian becomes the KMT chairman, visits China, and these are the first talks between the heads of the Kuomintang and CCP for years. You rule through local chieftains, so having one on your side is not a bad idea. Not that they're going to neglect the use of force in all this. The Gulf War shows that the world is not peaceful, and it shows the role of electronics and the role of technology in military power. The precept remains active defense. We're not going to go invade a place, but a PLA without modern technology would be powerless to prevent an independent Taiwan, which is unthinkable. Taiwan's the great blind spot, which we can talk a bit about some more. So there are cuts in manpower. There is also, interestingly, a focus on civil-military relations that shows you how differently the Chinese think about this from the way the Americans do. One of the things that happens after the 95-6 Taiwan Strait crisis is that Joseph Prior, who was then head of Pacific Command, one of his nightmares at the time was that he didn't know what his opposite numbers in the PLA were thinking. He realizes he has no way of reaching them. So he does what a good American admiral does after this, which is to say, well, let's forge some understanding, and starts reaching out to his counterparts and start talking to them. So this is perfectly normal for an American. In China, where the lines between the military and civilian spheres are much less clearly demarcated, you tend to live in fear of a military coup happening. So when Jiang Zemin visits Hawaii, one of the first things he does is he pokes Prior in the chest. Prior said it was in a nice way. He's been poked in the chest in not nice ways, but he said this was a nice way. And asks, Admiral, what are you doing with my military? And Prior says, well, sir, I'm trying to build trust between us so that we can avoid an incident. And Jiang says, for there to be trust, there must first be understanding. And for there to be understanding, there must first be communication. Which is a way of saying, you know, I'm fine with you doing this, but try to take it through me instead because I'm a little scared. The one problem with all this is it's active defense. But where is the line between active defense and hostility? When do measures that you take to secure yourself start looking aggressive to neighbors who might be smaller than you? And this, of course, becomes a major problem in the Xi Jinping era. So the question I get asked most often when I talk about this is the Xi Jinping era something fundamentally different? is it different from the grand strategy we've been talking about? And the answer I'd like to give is it's not different in kind, it's different in degree. It is different in that it is informed by an insecurity and fear that puts this entire grand strategy we've been talking about on steroids. The key thing about Xi Jinping is that the legacies he took from the Cultural Revolution are very different from those of a Jiang or a Hu. If you look at China, and if you're Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao, you look at China and say, well, this country, it's got its problems, some of them are quite serious, but think of where we were, and life's not bad. If you're Xi Jinping, you look at these problems and say, oh my God, we have religious separatists, we have corruption running amok. If we don't do something about it, the whole thing will fall apart right now, therefore I must control it. If you're Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao, you think of the Cultural Revolution, you say, that was a terrible, terrible thing, can't ever allow that to happen again, which means we're going to try to not rock the ship. There will be room for imperfection in order to handle this, room for consensus. If you're Xi Jinping, you look at the Cultural Revolution, you remember your father being demoted all of a sudden, yourself having to go do hard manual labor, and you say, this was a terrible, terrible thing. I will never let it happen again. And the only way to never let it happen again is to make sure that I am in charge. Because if I am in charge, then nobody can ever do this to me again. That's where his concept of security comes from. Forms a National Security Council, and it's interesting, the conception of security is that both internal and external matters fall within the purview of it. So Xinjiang as much as the Americans, corruption and the environment as much as Japan. Not that they're going to abandon economic reform despite the anti-corruption campaign, because you do have to be strong. Diplomatically, the model is pretty similar to what there was before. China seeks peaceful development, but won't brook interference with its core interests. That new model of great power relations, basically, if you read it, comes down to treat us as equals, which is an interesting thing to say. They will work with the Americans where it suits them, hence the climate change agreement. This was something they had a vital interest in and recognized it. And you see the benefits of keeping on talking to people with Japan, where you go from fairly dangerous circumstances in the East China Sea to the most stilted handshake in history, to Japan, China, and South Korea standing together saying, we will protect the WTO because we have vested interests in this, to Shinzo Abe visiting Beijing. They are lucky with the Philippines, where a little bit of bribery and a little bit of cajoling manages to mean that what an international court says about who stuff belongs to doesn't really matter.
Right.
Taiwan remains the big blind spot. She has this idea that by giving a Taiwanese leader the face of appearing with him, he will swing the election in favor of a pro-mainland or pro-mainland candidate, if that's the phrase I want. Backfires completely, because fundamentally, despite the closeness, China doesn't get Taiwan. And One Belt, One Road is the natural extension of a country that's grown to China's heft, investing in the rest of the world. So, if you look at where China was in 1920, which is when we started this story, where it was in 1949, and all the things it's encountered along the way, you'd have to say they've been fairly successful. Basic security being the goal, they have catered to that. The problem is that success can come with the seeds of its own failure. It's one thing to pursue the kind of grand strategy we've been talking about when you're at the size and heft of a Mao's China, or a Deng's China. It's another when you're pursuing it like China today. It's one thing to do it with the tone and blandness of a Jiang Zemin or a Hu Jintao. It's another to do it the way Xi Jinping does. What happens if, by modernizing your military, you cause immense fear in the Vietnams, Japans, and Indias of the world, causing them to spend more on their military, which means you in turn have to spend more on yours, which means in turn that those problems of debt are going to drag you down, especially since you're upping your security spending on Xinjiang, where you're going to create the very problem you're set out to solve in the first place. What happens when you have been economically successful? And this isn't just a question for China, but it's a question really about this entire path to modernity that China swallowed whole, and that the rest of us have articulated, which is, you keep your economy in decent shape, keep growing, that allows you to field a decent military and keep yourself secure. Don't mess up diplomatically and politically, you'll be okay. But what if that quest for economic growth undermines the very natural foundations that allow you to exist as a human being in the first place? Chinese civilization sprung up around rivers. Can an aircraft carrier help you when those rivers run dry? So I would say perhaps the lesson of all this is that whom the gods wish to punish, they give what they wish for.
So thank you for that wonderful gallop across so much of modern China. I would typically ask the 12 questions that leapt out to me from your book, but I see a bunch of China experts in our midst, so I am not going to do that. Who would like to ask a question of our guest? Okay, well, since they are too slow on the trigger, I am going to start with the first of mine. You made such an interesting point about the fear of the military and of a military coup. How should I understand Xi Jinping showing up in combat fatigues in front of military parades? Is that an expression of strength or an expression of weakness?
I would say the latter, and it comes from a certain place. So when you're going back to the Mao or Deng years, the line between the military and the party isn't drawn all that clearly. These are people who were both guerrilla warriors and then became paramount leaders. There are also people coming from a place where the idea that the military works as an instrument of the state isn't one that's been taken for granted. If you go back further in Chinese history, the idea of citizens' militias, outlaws brave of arm and strong of will, standing up against corrupt outsiders, regardless of what the central government had to say, is one that has a hold in the romantic imagination. So that's the tradition they're coming from. Chinese leaders subsequently spend a lot of time emphasizing that the party, not the state, the party, is in charge of the military. The military is supposed to respond to the party. This became especially important to them in the 90s when they perceived, rightly or wrongly, that people were encouraging the military to become more responsive to the needs of the state, which would imply that there's a state other than the party, which would imply that, a warlord can come, chuck the party out in the name of the greater good of the state. And that's how things are going to go. Now, when you get to the Xi Jinping era and you talk about anti-corruption, despite being deeply problematic at several levels, the anti-corruption rhetoric seems to me to be sincere. Given where he's been, he gets fundamentally that this is a real problem. And he talks about how you could lose the support of the people. And of course, if you're steeped in Chinese history, losing the support of the people is the first step to losing power. So prosecuting that in the military becomes important. The problem is that you're going after people with guns who can do lots of nasty things and have done nasty things pre-PRC time, at least that we know of. So how do you deal with that? The first thing you do is you inculcate loyalty in the military. So the military will sing songs of support to Xi Jinping. They will be reminded over and over again that they're not responsible to their leaders in the troops, but they're responsible to the paramount leader, who is one of them because he wears the fatigues, but he is the boss.
So two things that I especially love about this book. One is how much documentary evidence you cite for your judgments. It's so rare for a book of history to be this vibrant and still be great history. And I conclude from that this is two elements of your training. First, what I should also have said in the introduction, that Dr. Khan went straight out of college to an internship at The Economist and ended up being their stringer in Beijing for several years, and also has done a lot of work with the Cold War International History Project. So it gets the balance of those right. So I saw a ton of questions. First in the front row, sir. Please introduce yourself before you ask your question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Gordon Wilson. I'm a fellow at RUSI, member here, and a former naval person. So I want to ask about the island chain. The interaction between the other claimants seems to have died down because it was being very heavily handed at one time. Is that because they've feel that by developing as they have, they're now really it's too big and the others perhaps lie low? And also, with the freedom of navigation done by the Americans and the Brits and more other nations coming to join them, obviously the latest incident they had was pretty close, and they hadn't got any we had with the Soviets in the Cold War. Are they going to go much more belligerent with this one, or are they going
the Americans or the Chinese?
No, the Chinese.
Okay.
Given that they've, as you said, court of arbitration. They just sort of said that that's tough.
It's an interesting question. I think with the number of different claimants to that part of the world, it's difficult to say it's died down conclusively. So the Philippines have backed off. Vietnam's a different story. And given China's experience, that would be one country I would be reluctant to mess with much. But we'll see about that. So I don't think the Vietnamese are going to back off. The other thing worth mentioning is farther out to sea with fishing militias. Indonesia has actually got a grand way of handling this, which is blow up the boats. And they have done so. The scarier part is the freedom of navigation actions. And this, to my mind, gets at a fundamental problem that we have in the United States in the way we talk about China, is that we haven't figured out what we want. You can see why the South China Sea matters to China. We talked about people landing on that coast. People talk about how it's very important who controls the South China Sea because trillions of dollars of trade flow through it. It's worth noting that anywhere from 50 to 60% of that trade goes directly to China. And trusting freedom of the seas to a country that keeps talking about going to war with you is a risk someone like Xi Jinping is probably not prepared to take. So to the Chinese, it's like a fundamental issue of national security at this point, who controls the South China Sea, and it has to be them. The American view, by contrast, doesn't seem to me to be clear on this, and one of the reasons Harry Harris got into trouble was saying we need to do more forceful stuff on this. What is a freedom of navigation operation really doing? It has not eliminated Chinese islands. The balance of power has not shifted as a result of those. There's two ways of thinking about it. One is for the Americans to say, it's not worth all that much to us, which is a reasonable but, controversial claim to make. I'm not sure which side of it I fall down on because I just haven't gone through the whole thing to see. If that's the case, then we can stop wasting time. If it is true, as people will tell you, that the United States has a crucial interest in maintaining freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, which means in turn that we can't allow China to be there in the scale they are, then there's just one solution, which is to blow those islands out of the water. Nobody that I know of wants to do that.
Okay, so we have 3 more questions, 6 more minutes, 4 more questions, 6 more minutes. So I'm going to give each of our questioners 45 seconds to ask, then I'm going to give you 3 minutes to answer.
Okay.
First here. Yeah.
Samir Puri from King's College London War Studies. Obviously, you trace the history back to Mao and to the Warring States period, but pre-1912. Continuities with the imperial era. This is sort of the Alistair Ian Johnston grand strategy stuff. I mean, how much stake do you put in the preservation of some of those imperial trends in the eras you focus on?
Fabulous question. Back row.
Thanks.
Ben Welch, Montrose Associates. On Xinjiang, I've only got through the first chapter of your book, so Xinjiang is an external threat. Now you talk about it as an internal threat. What is your thinking, the current leadership view it as? One or other or both?
Magnificent questions both, and bonus points for concision. Back row.
Peter Lau, American Embassy. Quick question. How much does pre-1949 history matter for Chinese policy, domestic or foreign policy? And would you consider that, given its focus on cultural revolution, does capabilities matter for China when it comes up with its foreign policy, or is history more important?
Another great question. Last one, right here.
Hi, Xiao from Chinese Embassy. You mentioned about the Korean War, the Nixon's visit, etc. And now we have the recent speech by Pence on China. I just want to know, you talk about China's grand strategy. Do you think the U.S. now has a grand strategy towards China in response?
Those are all fabulous questions. You have 4 minutes before I bring this thing to a close.
Okay. Continuities with imperial era, yes, obviously. In terms of geography, certainly, that matters, because that basic geographic problem is a legacy of the imperial era. The other thing is, and this goes to the question about Xinjiang, is that China's current borders are very much a product of the imperial era. And if you compare the Qing dynasty's expansion with the PRC's expansion, the motives that drive them, fear and then ambition, are very similar. So yes, there's a lot of continuities there. Not as many as you would think listening to Mao talk about what he read. It turns out he didn't read as much about that stuff as he claimed to, but that's a separate story. Is Xinjiang an internal or external threat? That gets at the fundamental problem that most people have when trying to understand China, which is that the lines between internal and external get very blurry indeed. You don't really know. So the official policy line remains, it is an internal problem, right? But when you have borders with Central Asia, when culturally it's a little different from what China has been used to handling, and when the history is as complicated as it is, with Xinjiang occasionally being its own thing, then things become very dicey indeed. And one of the problems they have thinking about it is that they're not quite clear where the line is. The best articulation I heard of this was from a Tibetan in Nepal, who said, I always tell Chinese officials, if I'm Chinese, treat me like a Chinese. Why are you treating me differently? Which was
the argument of the American Revolution.
There you go. It is a fantastic argument to make, and it remains unanswerable in some ways. Capabilities versus history. I think the way you use your capabilities depends on your history, right? And it also depends on your personality. So one thing that I always ask myself when looking at here is, one of the arguments I get is, of course the Chinese are doing all this in the South China Sea and elsewhere because they now have the capabilities to do so. And as and when their capabilities grew, their ambition grew with it. The response to that is, what would Deng Xiaoping do? Would Deng Xiaoping do what Xi Jinping is doing in the South China Sea? The answer is no. Deng said that the biggest guarantee to him of safety was neighbors who felt secure. It was very simple to him. So why antagonize them needlessly? Would Deng Xiaoping have done in Xinjiang what Xi Jinping is doing? Again, the answer is no. Why create a problem that's bigger than the one you set out to solve? Same for Jiang Zemin. So capabilities matter, but the history matters too, and the history of the particular individual matters as well. Does America have a grand strategy on China? The simple answer is no. This is not an administration that does grand strategy. This is an administration that's...
We may not even be a country that does grand strategy.
We are a family business right now, which is a separate story. But look, the first thing that I read when I read the news this morning was that the trade war is now apparently off again. It has been on again and off again and on again and off again so many times that I've actually lost track, and I'm supposed to know something about this stuff. Pence's speech on China was, as a historian, completely disgraceful. It showed no understanding of what the Cold War was about. The Cold War was an ideological contest. It had us involved in proxy wars across the globe. And the list goes on and on and on. The open door policy that Pence invoked as us keeping China free was actually quite the opposite. It was meant to keep China open for trade to Western powers so that they didn't carve it up the way they had Africa. Different model of doing things. Short answer is no, we don't have a grand strategy on China. We desperately need one. We have a bipartisan consensus that might be framed today that something needs to be done about China. And we haven't got beyond that because we don't know what we want.
My friends, won't you join me in thanking Sulmaan Khan for this magnificent